Hi everyone, in this lecture I'll be going over qualitative studies and giving you some examples of qualitative research. We'll begin with exploring why you might want to use qualitative research, or why some of the articles that you are reading for your paper in this class chose to take a qualitative approach rather than a quantitative approach. I think one of the biggest reasons for using qualitative research is the ability to get more in-depth responses about your research question. So if we take anxiety, for example, you could provide a bunch of different folks a self-report measure of anxiety, and they could check off maybe whether or not they've experienced a symptom like a panic attack, or maybe rank the severity of that panic attack. But you're really not going to be able to get much in-depth information about how this particular person or group of people experience anxiety, what exactly that looks like for them. So for example, perhaps for one person, anxiety is excessive worry and a racing mind and difficulty focusing. But for someone else, maybe they're going to describe like tightness in their throat and feeling like they're going to pass out or their heart racing. And the depth of that response is what we're looking for and able to access a bit more easily with qualitative research. You're also going to get a more nuanced understanding of how things connect and work out in a person's life. And qualitative research can also sometimes be used to evaluate certain research protocols to see how they're being experienced by the participants. How do they feel about engaging in the research, for example? If you're studying something that is relatively understudied, a qualitative study might be a good place to start because you're going to maybe have a smaller sample than you would for quantitative research, than you would need for quantitative research. And so you're going to spend more time maybe with that smaller group and get more information, and then maybe use that information to then develop a quantitative study. And I'll give you some examples of that as we go along. And then finally, it is somewhat less restrictive than a quantitative study because you have the ability to modify questions in an interview, for example, or kind of see where a focus group goes without being tied to a certain list of questions. And of course, there are some approaches that are more structured than others, but that goes a bit beyond what we need for right now. Okay, so quantitative research answers questions about a lot of different things. It answers questions about clients, who they are, what their experiences, about service delivery, do they like therapy, not like therapy, what was helpful about it, not helpful, targets of intervention, so what are the types of things that have been helpful for them, what are the symptoms that seem the most prevalent that you might want to target, and so on. And so here are some examples. What is it like to have a client's experience? What are the perspectives related to treatment, i.e. satisfaction? The basics of qualitative research, the designs, as I've already mentioned, tend to be more flexible, and you're seeking to gain insight about a certain issue or a certain symptom or a certain disorder or a certain type of treatment and so on. Your goal is not to prove or disprove. You're not making any claims here about, this intervention has been proven to be the best. Like, that's not what this is about. In some cases, it may be lower cost, depending on how large of a qualitative study we're looking at, but it is a bit of a misconception that qualitative research is cheaper because you still, in many cases, need to pay research assistants for coding and things like that. So it's not necessarily that much less expensive. It tends to have smaller samples. If you're coding, for example, a 2-hour interview, you're not going to want to have 100 different interviews. That's a lot of time. So normally we're going to have much smaller sizes. In case study research, for example, you might only have one. And then they do tend to be more open-ended, where you're allowing the client or the participant to share what they want to share about a given issue instead of making them narrow into a self-report or giving them yes/no questions. Okay, so here are a couple of different qualitative research methods. So an interview, I think, is the most common, followed by a focus group, but you'll also see other things like observation and record keeping that are also very helpful in certain contexts. All right, so I'm going to give you some examples here of some qualitative studies. I'll start with a focus group. And this focus group that I'm going to focus on is attempting to answer the question of how effective is a psychoeducation intervention? So this research that I'm going to be talking about here is part of the La Clave public outreach campaign that's through USC and a great lab there, the Culture and Mental Health Lab. And the purpose, or one of the goals, I suppose, of this research is to help families to identify the symptoms of early onset, to identify the symptoms of schizophrenia at the first onset so that they can seek out treatment. The purpose being, if you can identify those symptoms in, say, your family member or your friend or whomever, and help them to seek out treatment early, their outcomes are going to be better. And so one of the ways that they went about doing that was developing this acronym of La Clave, with each letter standing for a sign or a symptom of schizophrenia. And these are in Spanish to help reach the Spanish-speaking community. And so you can read them here and match them perhaps to your DSMs and see how they work. But then what they ended up doing is they created a video training, essentially, a video, I don't even want to say it's a training, but it was more so like a skit, almost like a skit where people could watch it and then they could see the identification of the symptoms, and it was in Spanish. And so what they did was they had focus groups with 40 participants, mostly foreign-born Latinas, and they had a discussion about barriers to seeking treatment, as well as things that make them more likely to seek treatment. And then they would show the participants the video, the narrative, the role play, and then see if that was an effective tool to help the participants understand what the signs of schizophrenia are. And their findings did show that the narrative film was helpful, and the participants were able to identify more symptoms of schizophrenia than before they had seen the video. And in terms of the focus group itself, they found that it was a really helpful way of starting up dialogue. Okay. Another study that we'll look at here is focusing on interviews. And the research question here was, what do faith and thriving look like in understudied countries? And so this was a study that I was part of that involved going to El Salvador and interviewing some youth about a couple of different concepts that we were interested in. There's a list of a couple of them here. The one that I was most interested in was hope. I wanted to understand, what does hope look like? How is it encouraged? How is it maintained when you're experiencing adversity in this country with this group of people? And they were 18 adolescents ranging from 14 to 19. And then what we ended up doing is, after we did the interviews, we then coded those interviews using a thematic content analysis to find out more about how they understood these different concepts. And so for hope, a question like, where does your hope come from? Well, one of the participants said, well, it would be from God, because he gives me the strength to continue moving forward every day. So again, this is helping to understand a little bit about how hope is experienced and what encourages it in this particular context. And you can read the other ones as well. Okay, another approach would be qualitative observation, which basically is what it sounds like. So observing behavior in the natural environment without any forms of manipulation. And there's a couple of different approaches to doing this. One is the complete observer, which means that you don't interact or participate in any way. And so an example of this would be like if you're watching therapy behind a two-way mirror, or if you go to, say, your local Starbucks and you have a seat and you just watch what happens, and then you track different things based on what you're interested in. Advantages here: you're less likely to bias or influence the results, and it's very unobtrusive. Most people don't even know they're being observed. Limitations, though: you're not going to get really in-depth data, right? There's only so much you can get from observation, and you're still having to interpret what you're seeing. And then theoretically, the fact that people don't know you're observing them could have some ethical implications. Then you have observer as participant approach, which involves interviewing and interacting a little bit with the participants. And so in this case, you try to address some of that ethical stuff by letting them know you're a researcher and that you're going to observe, okay? That you're going to interact in some way. So this, of course, is going to risk a little bit of bias, because now the person knows they're being observed and maybe they're going to change their behavior. Although behavior is a bit more difficult to change than what you say. So, that might not be as big of an issue. An example would be like doing a survey at a store, where you're going to go and people are notified as they walk in. Maybe there's like a sign that says that, research is going on, and you're going to observe what happens. And maybe you're even going to ask them some questions about their experience or whatever. Then there's participant as observer approach, and this involves basically fully participating in what the group or in the phenomena that you're interested in, but also telling folks that you're a researcher. So you're not pretending that you're, also a heroin addict in the community center, right? You're letting folks know, but then you're wanting to become kind of enmeshed into that culture and into that environment so that you can see firsthand what that experience is like and observe what other people are experiencing as well. And so this is helpful when you're studying remote populations or understudied populations. So maybe like homeless veterans, right? Who may be somewhat cautious or who just may be difficult to access. And so you could kind of go around it in this way. Limitations, again, because you're telling folks who you are, the observation is a little bit less genuine. And this is more obtrusive, like people know, like you're in there, you're a researcher, you're there for a while, and this could be disruptive to their lives. And then finally is complete participant observation, where you are regularly interacting with the participants, you're fully embedded, almost like you're a spy, but you're not telling them basically who you are in many cases. And so, that's problematic in its own ways. But of course, this is advantageous in some ways too. It's a bit more natural. You have firsthand experience, and you get to kind of see things change over time because you're having that regular interaction. But of course, like with any kind of research where the researcher is involved to this length, or to this extent, excuse me, you're going to bring in your own perspectives and beliefs, and that can obviously skew your findings or cloud your observations. Okay, finally, we have narrative analysis, and in this case, there was a content analysis completed to examine health-related Twitter posts. And so this one, here's a citation for it, was done by Donnell and Booth, and they used a 24-hour cross-section of tweets, meaning they gathered all of the tweets in a period of 24 hours that contained the word or hashtag health. And then they basically did a thematic content analysis and found out what the common themes were across these tweets. And the themes, which makes sense, included health services, personal health practices, and health education. And the other thing that was interesting is that their tweets reflected political and social issues that were being publicized in the global media, which isn't surprising, but is cool to see kind of demonstrated in an empirical way. Implications of it, well, you can, by looking at this, we know that we can spread information, obviously, about health through something like Twitter. And as a matter of fact, we're kind of late to doing that. I think that now, especially with COVID, social media and other electronic means of communicating information have become more popular, but we're having to catch up a little bit. And we're still kind of behind in terms of the wide reach of social media for promoting health and mental health. All right, so that's it, a little overview of qualitative research so that you have a better idea of what it is you're reading as you consume some of the research in this class. We can talk more about this in class, of course, and I can give you more depth about the studies that I went over if you're interested. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you later.